my sweet peas, chickadees, and bees knees, and welcome to an especially special episode of What the Trans. So, you may notice that I have neither Ashley nor Alex here with me, but fear not, though my name may be Flint, I have not started a mutiny, but I am here to maybe rock the boat a little by providing you WTT in a different format to our usual three-course meal. Yes, in fact, this time we have what I will affectionately call a buffet. But first, let's do a little bit of housekeeping. Of course, the news still happens, loath as we all are to hear it, and we have provided a short list of links in this episode to various news stories we found recently, which you can check out, including the new legal challenge being made to the Supreme Court ruling by Trans Legal Clinic and the dream team that they have assembled of leading trans figures in the legal space. They have also got a fundraiser that we will link you to. Consider that your action alley of this week. Ashley has covered the M&S situation, and in doing so is correcting some misinformation that has been widely spread until recently when more verified information have come out. But now, the questions you're likely asking: what is it you're doing here? Why is the news so brief? Why is it just you here? What's going on? Well, we said we want to find a new balance between good news and bad news and important knowledge that is not news. And part of this is us wanting to sit down with trans people that are in various fields, and just sitting with them and talking about more community-based stuff. Obviously, you'll have seen this before with things like when we've interviewed Dion for the zines and when we've spoken about filmmaking with Vera Drew and covering the People's Joker. But this one I am actually so especially excited about. It's unreal. So we have a wonderful, and you've probably noticed quite long, sort of freeform discussion / interview with the one and only Jasmine Qureshi, who is a ecologist and trans non-binary woman who is very, very cool and has been running workshops on a concept called queering ecology. We'll get into that in further discussions. So I'm going to let the interview roll now. But basically, this is less of a, I ask straight up questions, then get straight up answers. It's more of a open discussion that's guided by some musings and queries. And so I will allow it to be taken away by a previous Flint and our co-host for this episode, Jasmine. Take it away. Interview. Hello. It is groovy to meet you. I mean, we've already met. So I am here with the wonderful Jasmine. If you want to introduce yourself to our wonderful listeners.
Hello. Yeah, it is good to be here. But yeah, we've met in person, which feels more real than what we're doing now. So it's interesting to go, it's nice to meet you now virtually as opposed to the other way around.
Normally we do things in the reverse order.
Yeah.
So like we've been wanting to get this conversation done since like April. It's been an idea. And it's been slowly just the way that life goes, things come up, things happen, and we're finally able to sit down now and actually have this chat, which is one that I've been really excited for quite a long time because I'm a big fan of the work that you do.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm very, very excited to get into this. If you want to, I guess, start off by explaining kind of what you do and what you want to talk about today.
This is the dreaded question.
Yeah.
The only other question that I fear as much is, what is your favorite insect? We'll try and answer both in due time. But the first one, what do I do? I'm very intrigued by this myself. And when people ask me, I'm almost like, I actually don't know. And then I'm like, well, actually, I'm interested in how biology builds our realities and how ecology, specifically within biology, builds that interactional reality around you. And by that, I mean, we all interact with the world, when we breathe, when we move, when we do anything, we are interacting with the world around us. And I think on a molecular level, you can really understand, if you think about it enough, or if someone facilitates you to think about it or guide you through it, you can start to understand that every single change that occurs around you is in part due to you being in that space. And you can go with that more sort of hard reality wise, where molecular wise, you're changing things by moving around and breathing. And you can also go semantics wise or philosophical wise, where everything that we say is, we're transactionally building our reality because we're talking about it, we're communicating, we're figuring out what things mean and that sort of thing. So for me, ecology plays such a big part in that because all of our policies, everything that governs our lives and moves us around, whether we like it or not, is governed by observations that were made of other organisms, of the world around us, and of systems and structures around us. And those include non-human organisms. So biology builds a big part of our policy, it builds a big part of our societal reality. And I'm like, well, society is a bit rubbish at the moment, especially in the Western Hemisphere and in colonized nations and on colonized land. It's pretty awful. So a big part of that is the policies, the realities that were built, and a big part of that is biology. And so I'm like, well, I've been interested in biology and ecology for so many years, and now I do this thing called queering ecology. So that's what I study as part of my PhD. I do a PhD in queering ecology, and that includes queering as a structure, as a mechanism. How do we use it to untangle, unravel biology and ecology as being this set of patterns, this set of normalities? And so that's what I'm studying, and I write about it too. I also write about structures like racism, classism, all the other juicy things that kind of mix into my life and how I've grown up. And I use that lived experience in seminars, in workshops, and that can be around queering ecology specifically, which is interesting because it's not a specific topic, which I'm sure we'll talk about, but it's also about insects and bugs. And they're a big part of my PhD and a big part of my life. I'm a previous sort of recovering marine biologist. And
I'm sorry, I have to ask, recovering marine biologist, can I ask briefly about what that means to you? Because
yes.
that's an interesting statement.
Oh, it's because studying colonial capitalist science is traumatic, especially if you're not curated to colonialist capitalist science in the way that I am a trans racialized, non-binary queer woman. And so
Yeah.
me studying something that is inherently connected to patriarchy, to whiteness, to heteronormativity, to ableism, it's going to cause lasting trauma. So
Yeah.
I'm recovering from being forced into a narrative that I simply don't understand. So I'm a recovering marine biologist, and I'm trying to
I like that a
pull
lot. I like that a lot.
I'm trying to pull my, I mean, I was going to say no offense to the institution, but actually much offense to the institution. You could have done a
Yeah.
lot better.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No, we want to offend the institutions. That's like the point.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
So I'm pulling myself out of that. And that's kind of what this queer ecology or queering ecology journey is, trying to understand where I fit in that, and using insects as this catalyst because I think they're decolonial gems in this ecological tapestry that we have of the world. Like our ecosystems are built by them, they are filled with them, and they're just default transgressors, which I'm sure we'll also come to as well. What do I do
Mm.
alongside that? I'm also a poet and use that in my work because I think it's transgressional. I think it's quite beautiful. I guess I'm a sort of journalist. I had that on my CV for a long time because that's kind of where I started. And I advise various organizations and NGOs. I used to do more NGOs. They don't really like me now. Organizations and other kind of community structured places on what does regenerative ecology mean? What does queering ecology mean? Can it be a form of liberation or resistance in ecology and biology? Yeah, what does all of this mean?
Maybe we should then start with the practice of queering and what that is and delve into that a little bit because I
Mm.
think that that's probably one of the areas where a lot of people are very used to hearing queer as a label, as a signifier. And I think many people can consider it, like I consider it a praxis, like a practice to be queer,
Mm,
as an active thing, because for me, um, to be queer is an inherently political thing,
mm,
at least in the sense of you're put into a positionality whether you like it or not. Um, but the idea of it being queering, as I think it's clearly coming from quite a different, not a different perspective, but like you're using it in a very specific way. So by all means, break that down for us.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm really interested and I really like the usage of queer as a sort of being word and an action word where you sit in an identity that is forever moving. And I'm kind of playing with that with queering because inherently the word queer is about difference, dissonance, divestment. It's about moving away from something. That's the reason it was kind of made. It starts off as a slur in Western Hemispheric society, as an English word. It starts off as a slur, and so it's used to other people because it means you're different than us. You're strange, you're weird, you're odd. You don't belong in the same category as us, and we are the normal. And that is kind of the crux of queer, is that you are not the normal. And that doesn't mean, society wise, as it's kind of been mainstreamed, that you need to be corrected. But actually, it probably refers more to the kind of data identification or identity of normal, where normal is the largest pattern of stuff in a system. It's the largest pattern or set of patterns of stuff that do a similar thing. That's the normal. So everything outside of that that does slightly different things or looks slightly different or is slightly different than that giant clump of, normal, of stuff that does the same thing, that's abnormal. So queer exists as abnormality, which again is not necessarily incorrect. And in fact, most of the time, and probably all of the time actually, is not incorrect, because what is correctness? What is incorrectness? But that also comes into like queerness and queer identity, making a new correct, making a new normal. So with queer, I'm kind of playing with this idea that actually this isn't an end game term. This is not a term where we have founded it from our own selves necessarily, and we are looking at the end game of community. We're looking at an outcome for community. And you could argue there are no end games for any community, because actually we're all just moving in loads of different directions all at the same time. So we don't really necessarily have to go somewhere and stay there. However, within the society we exist in, especially in Western Hemispheric society, and especially in colonized nation society, there is a proposed end game, and that is the current state of society. It's the norm, it's the normality of society. It's cis normativity, it's heteronormativity, it's able-bodied normativity, it's whitewashing, it's patriarchy. These are things that are normalized in society as being the biggest, most dominant structures, and therefore you must be curated to them to work well within this society. So therefore, anything that moves away from that could be argued is queer, because it pushes away from that, what I like to call a toxic normality. So therefore, to me, if we're forever pushing away from that, then we should really be identifying queerness and queering as divestment. We are divesting from a toxic normality. We're pushing away from it. We could be doing that out of pain. We could be doing that out of desperation. We could be doing that out of joy. We're probably doing it out of a mixture of all of these different things. But we should recognize that we are divesting, and we're not creating necessarily just yet a society that is born of our own volition, of our own centeredness. Because I think then we run the risk of erasing the fact that we are not free, and that we are still quite trapped within capitalist and colonialist systems. So queering is the action of that, I think. It's the movement of that. And also it brings into play the fact that the queerness is about divestment. It doesn't go queer, a static, stuck identity. It doesn't go, oh, this is where we find freedom. This is where we find liberation. This is all of it in one block. because what that does is it introduces colonialist or capitalist queerness, which does exist and most definitely already dominates the spaces that we're in. It introduces those and it goes, they're also part of liberation, because queer is a whole identity and it liberates everyone. And that runs the risk of mixing in all of these neoliberal and all of these toxic ideologies with what's supposed to be a divestment, a liberatory action or mechanism. So I think queering and adding that little ing on the end is a bit semantic. It's not necessarily, it's not going to free everyone. But to me, I'm using it as a mechanism now. I'm plugging it into other structures and I'm going to queer this. I am queering this. Therefore, I am destabilizing or dismantling it as a toxic normality. I'm deconstructing it. So that's kind of why I use queering. And I do agree that, I think within Western Hemispheric society and colonized nation society, we have a lot of language for exploitation. We have a lot of language for divestment. We don't really have any meaningful language around liberation because we are still very much trapped within a process of colonization and I think dismantling of our own freedom. So we don't have any language necessarily for liberation, which means we're going to struggle to come up with terms on our own, but that's okay. I think being humble to that is also quite useful. You can go, I'm queer, and that was born of joy, but it doesn't mean I'm free. It just means that I'm finding more joy in this space than my previous space, which was trapped and covered and choked.
It's sort of like the difference between the individual freedom of mind that you feel when you are finally able to meet yourself on your own terms and recognize who you are and how you're operating in this world. But that doesn't change the fact that you're still in this system. And no matter how much you are happy and free of the heart and soul, it's not going to change the fact that you still live in this system. You have to operate in this system. And yeah, that the friction between those two things is, I think, where a lot of cognitive dissonance can come in. That means that I think sometimes we can, as queer people and as trans people, sometimes fall into a trap of thinking that just existing can be enough. And as much as just existing, absolutely, we need all of us to exist. We want as many people to exist as possible. That's not up for debate. It can be radical whilst it's not dismantling anything radically necessarily. In terms of the wider power structures that we have, right? It can have a radicalizing and dismantling effect on, say, the people around you, on, say, what you're doing, how you're moving through the world. I'm sure many people have had that thing where they've been open enough about who they are and how they're operating. I've had this myself, and then someone will come to you and go, hey, I relate a lot to what you're posting. What does that mean? And that kind of thing. There's that element of it. But yeah, I think that to make queer an active doing word by saying queering, I think it highlights that a little bit more. You can be queer, but you're not always queering.
I think that's kind of where it kind of stands. It's this little highlight. It's this little introduction. Because like you just said as well, if you're comfortable and you're happy in this system, that doesn't necessarily mean that everything else is comfortable and happy around the world. And actually, I would argue the more comfortable and the more happy you are in a colonial capitalist system, the more you are curated to the system itself, because you have the privilege, and I'm using privilege here to mean access. You have the privilege to access certain resources. And if you have the privilege to access majority of the best resources within a system, you're probably privileged enough to be happy and comfortable within a colonialist capitalist system for a very long time, which means you're not really going to notice if there are toxicities within the system, like systemic racism, like, systemic patriarchy, like toxicities within the environment. For example, if we're to talk about like London as an area to live in, there are more gentrified areas of London now where people have moved in, resources have been injected into a system, but only for certain people. which means they're going to be comfortable now in London, not even knowing that maybe a few streets over or even a couple of streets down, the air quality is completely choking and toxifying, the environment for people, for other organisms. They're also not going to know that maybe crime rates there are higher due to lack of resources, due to a destabilization of infrastructure. But they're not even going to realize that because within their small little bubble, they are safe and comfortable, which means they live in the same area. And therefore, they may think that the area is comfortable and happy and joyful and the infrastructure is fine and everything's working for everyone and the government's lovely. But they don't realize because they have too much access and therefore they aren't the right people to be able to recognize this. So queering is also about pulling up those people and going, okay, you have the queer community, you have all of this joy and freedom and love is love and everything is free and that sort of thing. But are you not erasing the very real lives of very victimized, very oppressed groups within your group who are becoming erased by the fact that your voice is louder than theirs because you're more privileged and you have more access to certain resources? So it also brings the other thing that you were I think you kind of touched on, where there are other identities in this as well. There are other things at play here. We're not just queer. We are queer and there are multiple parts of us that have become mixed up and entangled and maybe even erased by that word. So I'm quite suspicious of the word queer a lot of the time. I'm quite suspicious of whenever it comes into a conversation, whenever it's a headline or a label on something, I'm like, yeah, but who's the queer that's behind this? Like which one of you made this? Because based on that, then I can go, okay, that's going to be liberational. Or I'll go, that's probably going to be tokenistic. That's probably going to be symbolic only. And therefore, you might actually be posing more of a danger to us than even an outright fascist. Because we say that, don't we? And we hear that a lot of the time, where liberalism is sometimes a lot more dangerous, in fact, often a lot more dangerous than fascism itself, because it poses as one of your community and it will dismantle it from the inside. Because again, it accepts the oppression, it accepts the destruction of oppressed peoples because of the comfort to its own people who might not even be on their way to this joyful utopia that they believe in so much that has been fed to them, but they feel slightly better off than the people underneath them. So therefore they will never allow liberation to come to the masses because they're so happy sitting in that position. So that's I think you're right, queering, even making that little change on the word, it highlights some of those things and it's kind of introductory, right? It brings an idea across to a lot of people, but it doesn't actually settle it, which I think is important as well, because then you can go, oh, but how much more could we do? Like we could go a lot deeper.
Yes.
We don't need to just stop at queering, because queering is just this little kind of thin blue line on this planet of stuff that could be done.
The idea of queering as a tool for divestment is the word that you've used, and we're talking really here about how to dismantle colonialism. Would you be happy to go over the differences between decolonization and divestment? Because I know that a lot of people can consider divestment as a method towards decolonization.
That kind of is one of the foundational elements of what I'm trying to do with queering. And side note, I'm also very suspicious of my own practice most of the time, because what I'm doing is forging this, in my own words, divestment, deconstruction. But I'm doing it from English as a language. I'm doing it from seat of empire. I live in London. I may have, oppressions upon me as a racialized trans woman, as someone who is working in a space that I've often really not been able to move forward at all in so many areas. But I have a lot of privilege too. And the recognition of that kind of pushes more into what is this work and how does it exist? And that kind of goes straight into the differences between decoloniality and divestment, because to start, my definition of colonialism or colonization is the occupation and exploitation of stuff. So it can be the occupation and exploitation of words, ideas, spaces, land, people, any structure. You occupy it, you fill it, and then you exploit it and you overexploit it and you take from it to the point at which it dies and you are nourished, or at least you are full, because you may not even be nourished, because who can be nourished off of colonialism? But in that same stream, if I'm decolonizing, then basically what I'm doing is I'm dismantling the mechanisms that make it possible to occupy and exploit anything in an overexploitative fashion. And another little side note for this is that if we're talking about exploitation, we do have to be a bit careful, because everything exploits. Exploitation on its own isn't necessarily a terrible or evil thing. There are multiple ecosystems on the planet that have organisms within them that exploit said landscape. Overexploitation is kind of what we're talking about when we mean the evil exploitation, because overexploitation is destroying something to the point at which it can no longer regenerate resource. It can no longer give anything back to any organism or structure that is working to exploit some of the resources within it. So overexploitation is awful. Then going back to that, there are mechanisms that make it possible to occupy and exploit a landscape, a structure, a people, whatever that might be. And that could be machinery, that can be funding for machinery, that could be governments, that could be, you know, groups, organizations, that can be mindsets and perspectives. So when you're decolonizing, you're dismantling the structures that make it possible for those things to exist. And some people might say, oh, well, that is divestment. And I think that's true and not true. I think divestment is the moving away from things. When you're divesting, you're separating yourself. You're separating from things. That is dismantling a part of that mechanism. That's dismantling a part of that structure, because what you're doing is you're taking yourself out of the algorithm. You're moving away so that you don't fund said structure, said mechanism, which means, in a way of speaking, you are decolonizing because you are deconstructing colonial mechanism. But decolonization as a structure is quite academic. It talks a lot about how theoretically you can deconstruct something. Decolonial theory itself is also filled with a lot of anti-oppression theory. It's also filled with abolition theory. It's also filled with abolition action. It's filled with lots and lots of different structures. So I think decoloniality is so much bigger than what divestment is. I think divestment can be an actionable change that you do that may pave the way for decolonization to occur. But there is this other issue where the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house is from Audre Lorde. It basically works on the fact that fundamentally the systems that are made work by oppressive peoples, oppressive groups, oppressive structures, they can never be used to dismantle that system, because fundamentally they work for that system. And one of the examples that people talk about a lot is democracy. Democracy is the idea that, again, you can vote your way out of oppression. You can vote your way into pretty much anything, because you have a system, you have system reps, you have community reps. You know, we sort of know how democracy works. I'm not sure anyone really does, but we sort of know how.
It's debatable that the UK even is a democracy when you look at the actual mechanisms and definitions of democracy, and then you compare that to what's actually happening in this country. I'd argue that a lot of what we see as democratic countries are operating a homunculus-esque attempt at democracy, but realistically it's different systems using the veneer of democracy. But maybe that's another talk for another time.
Yeah, but that's kind of deeply connected to what we're talking about right now, because you could almost argue that, you know, who developed democracy in its original form, it probably isn't even democracy. That's not what it's called. That's not what it is. Its original form is representation within, you know, a board, a group that therefore gets to regulate the rest of the system that the people itself live in. So it's people delegating, controlling their own system, their own structure. Democracy, it can be argued, is then, you know, in this country anyway, in this system, one of those master's tools, because it will never dismantle the oppressive system that it is, because it is that system. So therefore, kind of going back to decoloniality, can you decolonize a colonizing system? Many people would argue that you cannot, and actually a lot of attempts within especially Western academia and Western hemispheric academia and colonized nation academia, and also within spaces that do a lot of theorizing but not too much action, you could argue that they're not really decolonizing. It's a lot of theoretical understanding of, well, we could maybe dismantle something if we think about it slightly differently. And that is not very useful to a lot of very vulnerable and oppressed groups because, again, they're not feeling the benefits of that nothing around them is being deconstructed. So it could argue that divestment is actually a power move by groups that are affected, or even groups that aren't affected, that have majority power or have, who hold certain resource in a system, to take away the resource access and the funding that fundamentally keeps the systems that colonize people alive. So therefore, is divestment decoloniality? It could be. Is it more actionable than decoloniality? It depends who's doing it and who's talking about it and how you're doing it. We see right now, especially, we see right now majoritively around Palestine, we see that there are targeted boycotts happening. That targeted divestment is a useful and very direct line of action that a lot of people within empire can take to take away funding and therefore take away the things that prop up these oppressive systems. But if you have a divestment action that doesn't necessarily become targeted or work within a unified front, or starts to, again, confuse people as to what they're supposed to be doing within a community or group, you could argue that that might just be symbolism and it might not really do anything at all. But it depends who's doing it, because, again, if you take yourself out of this system, if you take yourself out of a Western hemispheric system and you go into a system where maybe there's more affecting people directly within that system, divestment might work more directly there. People divesting, or, for example, if they stop working in an area that funds their own environmental destruction, that funds the destruction of their homes, if they stop working in those areas and move away from it, that could be far more useful than what we do here. Doesn't mean that we stop what we're doing, but we do also need to be humble to the fact that our decolonial work, our divestment work, is completely different than work around the world that is directly affected peoples, that is, moving structures that are affecting directly affected peoples. I've said affecting a lot, but yeah, it is that. I think you really, if you think about it, you can see the differences between the words, you can see the differences between the structures, but maybe it's more useful to be guided by people who are just embodying the work. I have these two kind of things, and binaries are kind of a bit weird, but they work sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I have these two kind of terms that I kind of link to this, which is embodied liberation and theoretical liberation. And embodied liberation is kind of many steps beyond what we are at here. We're still unlearning a lot of the toxicity that has been sown into us. We're still unraveling a lot of that. We're still unraveling where we stand and how complicit we are in literally everything that happens around the world. So we can't really hope to be as embodied in our liberation as a lot of communities and groups around the world that are being directly affected by this and are already embodying the liberational understanding of not just action against oppressors, but also mutual respect and feeling and interaction with the land. Another example, is Palestinians and their understanding of their land, their understanding of what grows, the understanding of what organisms exist in that environment. That is ecological embodiment of liberation, as opposed to us who's starting to understand that maybe other animals have feelings.
Yeah.
Oh, maybe they have care systems. Perhaps we should stop cutting large areas of our land into small squares. Maybe we should start trying to understand how cities and humans are not unnatural. We're actually just overly exploitative areas of another natural existence. We're doing like introductory stuff.
Ooh.
We're doing queering.
Would you be able to break that down a little bit more? The idea of cities and these kind of, concrete spaces being natural, because I think that's quite an interesting idea.
Oh, that this is one of my most favorite things to touch on. We have someone who a lot of people look up to, and I used to look up to, and I don't look up to anymore at all. And his name is David Attenborough.
Okay, we're taking shots at the big nature dad. Let's go for
Yes,
it. Let's
the
go
big
for
nature dad.
it. The granddad of the
Yes.
granddad of Granada, not
Oh
even Granada,
God.
BBC, whatever.
But David Attenborough is interesting because he is the face of a lot of people's first interaction with the beauty of the world that is nature, that is outside of their reach. You know, he is the voice of that big thing that comes on screen and you see in amazing technicolor, you see it in amazing sound, everything just comes on screen and you're like, whoa, this is the world beyond who I am. Maybe that enlightens you. Maybe that's really useful and powerful. It definitely did to me. I grew up in a flat in London. I didn't have a garden. I didn't have really any, like, we had a park nearby, but we didn't really have any nature reserves nearby. It was quite difficult to get
Yeah.
to your stereotypical green space, which is nature in quotation marks. That's what's provided to you in the UK.
Yeah, because even parks are manufactured. They've got lawns down. They'll have things built in them. If they've got trees, those trees will be planted. They're very rarely natural ones that have like just been, very rarely do we just let a space be and then just put a thing around it and go, let's just leave that and let it live, let it
Mm,
be. So I know what you mean. Like the nature spaces I can access when I'm here, where I live, and where I go about normally is very different from the nature spaces that I get to access when I go down south to London. Because I feel like you do have to kind of find your spots. And I'm even talking about when I'm in a part of London that's actually a lot greener than the average.
that whole narrative will link directly into like what we're talking about,
Mm.
finding your quote unquote green space in London. So yeah, I mean, I grew up with David Attenborough on screen and could see all of this amazing stuff. And I sort of thought, wow, this is something that I really want to pursue. I would love to be in these areas. I couldn't. And so I became very upset, like as a very young person, and also later on in my life when I tried to do a lot of the things that I'd seen, not just on screen, but that were presented to me as what a nature lover does. And so I
Mm.
couldn't access those because of all the things we've talked about, because of the systemic toxicity, the systemic racism, that sort of thing. So David Attenborough can be that introduction to people. But I don't think it's because he's this magical being that introduces nature to people's lives. I think it's because he's the only one there doing that thing, because he's been funded to do it by a
Um,
gigantic media machine, which is known as the BBC, to basically take over large areas of education, of representation, of understanding of the natural world through this thing called blue chip documentaries. And blue chip documentaries, I don't know if you've heard the term, but they're large scale documentaries with the largest amount of funding. They have incredible visuals, they have incredible audio. They are basically, yeah,
right.
it's your blockbuster but documentary.
So it's like the AAA games,
Yes.
like the AAA for video games
Yes.
is where that's where you get like your Red Dead Redemptions, your Skyrims, well, maybe not Skyrim, but yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
nerds say that.
It's your Star Wars, your Marvel, but
Mm.
documentary, nature documentary. And the BBC specializes in blue chip documentaries. The BBC specializes in Planet Earth, in
Mm.
in all the other ones that I've forgotten the name of. I should know them. I kind of grew up on them. But
There's
they're
Our Planet, I think
yeah,
that's one.
our planet, Planet Earth.
Yeah.
They're like Planet, Dinosaur Planet. And there's lots of planets.
Oh, Walking with Dinosaurs. What an absolute OG that was.
Walking with
Oh,
Dinosaurs is, I would argue that's not a blue chip. I really love that though, but
okay.
I do
Yeah.
enjoy that because dinosaurs were kind of also a big part of my childhood. My claim to fame is being on the official Jurassic Park podcast talking about velociraptors, which I'm so happy about.
Yes. Yes. No, that's absolutely like in an icebreaker. That's going to be the guaranteed thing I would bring up every time.
I
Absolutely.
should do that. I don't do that enough.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think people know that. I always get afraid that people are going to be like, "Oh, so what do you think about the velociraptors in Jurassic Park and how they're not biologically accurate?" And I'm like, "What do you know about? No one knows about biologically accurate velociraptors anyway."
Yeah. Like one of my favorite places in London is the Crystal Palace Gardens because you get to see all of the old statues and recreations of what they thought dinosaurs looked like.
Oh
Um,
yeah.
and that's really interesting to me because it's kind of become an exhibit with multiple layers
Hmm.
where it's on the surface of it, it's a lovely green space and you've got, oh, these old ideas of what dinosaurs were. But then when you think about it a little bit deeper, it's like, no, I'm seeing not only an exhibit on dinosaurs, I'm also seeing an exhibit on the Victorian state of science and paleontology at the time,
Hmm.
which is also inherently then an exhibit on how we curate and maintain certain parts of history or science that we consider useful, even if only for the comparison point of, lol, wasn't that silly?
Hmm.
And to me, that's just a very fun, a little trifle of epistemological wonder.
I mean, it shows how biology builds certain realities because, again, we've built this entire reality around what an organism does, how it works, how it breathes, how it moves. And if you consider that we actually used to think, or we have thought in many, many areas of science, that things definitely happen in the way they do in that particular pattern.
Mm.
And we normalize that pattern and then we
Mm.
imposed it on other organisms and also societies and communities of humans, then you start to realize, oh, we do build realities and then we impose them and inject them. And then we find it very hard to question them because we don't have the resources maybe to question. But that's all part of queering. But anyway, going back to blue chips, and why we started talking about dinosaurs, which is
Yes,
amazing.
yes, yes.
But blue chips, yeah, are these gigantic orchestral documentaries that are provided, and people basically have a very romanticized idea of what nature is through these blue chips. And they definitely construct the foundations of how people understand the natural world. There are blue chips on, the life of mammals, which is
Mm.
a really incredible documentary series, but it's narrated by old white guy David Attenborough. It contains basically no indigenous or native folk or native community understanding of the natural world because it's all a whitewashed Western colonial narrative of mammalian science. And also, on top of that, it cuts out a lot of it. It changes it to make it palatable to the public because it's all about entertainment. I used to work as
Mm.
a researcher at the BBC Natural History Unit, and I worked in the development unit and I worked in the production unit and a bunch of other things. I wasn't really there for that long because the BBC are a bit weird, to understate how bad they are.
What a surprise.
Yeah. But it was my first kind of job out of uni. And doing that work, you definitely see that as a young person, my dream was to educate and to communicate to the world my love of nature, my love of other organisms. But they're all about entertainment. These documentaries are all about
Mm.
entertaining audiences, which means you have to build a certain narrative. You have to build a certain idea of nature. You also have to build a certain idea of storytelling, which means because you have a massive budget, because you're the BBC, you're basically government certified to get budgets. You have a massive, very, very elitist board. You basically can go wherever you want. Now you basically push out a lot of the other independent storytellers. You push out a lot of the local storytellers. And so you create this massive, massive space of elitist storytelling. And through that, you push Western colonial science and ecology. And you have as the face of
Mm.
it this very old, very, very posh white man who becomes the face of nature storytelling. And you notice that a lot of presenters
Mm.
that come after David Attenborough do utilize the way he talks about things. They utilize the actions,
Yeah.
to be a nature presenter, you talk in a certain way. I used to think this when I was growing up because I wanted to be a nature presenter, a nature TV
Mm.
presenter. And so I'd look at like I'd look at like Chris Packham and like people like that. And I go, who's another television presenter, does things like Spring Watch and that sort of thing. You see
Yeah.
people and you're like, I need to be like them in order to talk about nature. And so then growing up in the UK, you have this idea that either I'm not enough or I need to be more like them. So I need to conform. I need to change the way I talk about nature. I need to change the way I think about the world around me. And so if David Attenborough does that, it's kind of colonialist. In fact, it's very colonialist. He talks a lot about overpopulation, or he used to anyway.
That's one of the things that has bugged me more and more in recent
Yeah.
years. Because as I learn about the myth, the outright fucking lie
Hmm.
that is overpopulation, but it feels like almost every time I put on a nature documentary, at a certain point in time, they're eventually going to, at least for one sentence, hint at the idea that the Earth is overpopulated, as opposed to hint at the idea that we have death machines
Hmm.
running all over the world and that we aren't overpopulated.
Hmm.
Uh, we're overexploited,
Hmm.
and we're over condensed in certain areas as opposed to spread out.
I mean, amazing segue into basically what this point was originally started as, which is cities, because that is fundamentally why I talk about cities being a natural thing. And if people wanted to look more about overpopulation and don't necessarily have the time or capacity to read a massive book on why these are myths that are, pushed by governments and pushed by oppressive systems. There is someone on Instagram called, he's also on many other things. This would be very weird actually if I'm like, you're from Instagram. He's from a lot of other things. Dr. Jason Hickel. He's an anthropologist and he puts a very, very well summarized and easy to read explanation of why overpopulation is a myth. And people can read that if they want to understand more, because it is a bit of a weird thing to wrap your head around, because logically, too many humans, too much resources, put the humans down, make them smaller, therefore world is better. That's
Mm.
quite an easy idea to digest, but it is not true. And it is primarily pushed by racist, ableist, patriarchal paradigms from colonialist governments that just wish to exploit land and exploit resource.
Yeah,
Basically.
because like the question is the first question is okay, then who would be the people
Hmm.
that aren't making the cut? And it sure as shit isn't going to be people on Wall Street.
Hmm.
They're going to argue that they're valuable and needed all day long. It's going to be people like me and people like you that end up having to fight for their worth to exist. And it inherently lends itself to fascism.
Hmm.
The idea of overpopulation inherently lends it. There's no way you can talk about overpopulation as a thing and propose a solution to it that is not fundamentally eugenicist
Hmm.
at its core, because you're having to decide the worth of whatever living beings you're putting in the catchment net of overpopulated.
Yeah, like we're not overpopulated. We have enough resources for every human on Earth to be very comfortable. But what we do have is over concentration and over exploitation. And this is why cities come into it, because a city is not unnatural. Because what is unnatural? What's unnatural about a human building something that they got from the land? Every building within a city, every material, every resource is taken from the land. There is an issue with how it's taken. There is an issue with where it goes and how it's processed, but it comes from the land. So if you're going to say that it's unnatural, you're not talking about the material itself. You're also not talking about the person who makes it. You're talking about the process. You're talking about the mechanism of building it. And that can be considered unnatural. Again, not because it's not green, it's not grass, it's not a tree. It's more so because you have squashed a giant population of living organisms, human and non-human, most primarily human, into a smaller space than is useful or habitable or comfortable for them to exist in, regeneratively anyway. You have taken away the infrastructure that allows them to be comfortable. You've taken away the care systems within that space. You've also plugged in suffocating mechanisms. For example, we can consider concrete to be made of a natural resource. But if you're suffocating the land and you're also not providing enough, for example, holes in the concrete for the land to breathe, you're not providing enough spaces for things to grow. You're also moving forward too fast, which means the land doesn't evolve well with the roads that you're building. Then what you're doing is over exploiting and suffocating the land, which means that a city is not unnatural because a human built it and because humans are unnatural and therefore humans need to be culled. What you've done is you've choked the land with over exploitation and you've choked the land with over concentration. And you see it in other animals as well. There are lots of other organisms where they are pushed into a small area of land. The resources are too little in that area of land for them to exist in the population that they are, again, in that small space. It's not the population itself, it's the fact that they're squashed into that space. and they're forced to live in that space, which humans are because of rent prices, because of economy, because of resources that they need to access, because of migration, where they're forced into underdeveloped areas and then their care systems are taken away, their families are taken away. They're not allowed to think or be educated in a way that is comfortable, because again, all of these structures are choked in order to push people into smaller areas. And other organisms do it too, and we see the land becoming poisoned there. But we don't go, oh, that organism is unnatural. We go, that process has become over concentrated. It's become over exploitative. And the reason for over exploitative, over concentrated cities is capitalism. It's colonialism. Because there are cities that have existed pre-colonially that have been living mutually and reciprocally with the land. They have lived with the land. They have taken mutually from the resources of the land, because again, you exploit naturally, but there's an understanding of the land as an entity. There's an understanding of other organisms as entities that exist within your ecosystem. And the ecosystem is also allowed within the city. So I wouldn't say that London is unnatural because it has maybe less green spaces. I would say that London can be over exploitative because there aren't enough infrastructure props to make sure that people are cared. There aren't enough structures in place to make sure that other organisms are also cared for within a lot of the areas. And I don't think that, for example, growing a few trees in London is going to change the landscape of London and apparently make it better. I think that it's lovely that London, because London itself has a lot of nature. London is very biodiverse. It's really good for insects. There's a lot of brownfield sites, and brownfield sites are kind of, they're sites that organizations leave because they're like, we can't do anything with it. You know, we can't turn it into a park. We can't turn it into recreation. We can't build anything necessarily on it. It's kind of useless. So we're just going to leave it there, and we'll call it a brownfield site because in our minds, nothing useful is there. But they're really useful for a lot of insects. A lot of insects build their homes there. There's a lot of other organisms that will live in brownfield sites. Masonry and stonework are useful for a lot of bees to make homes in. You know, 70% of bees don't make hives. They live in the ground. They live in stonework, that sort of thing. They're really foundational for ecosystems. Cities are really biodiverse. London itself is a national park now. It's, you know, it's allocated as an area where there are lots of different organisms that are living together. I think it's really beautiful. I do think it's still overexploitative, but I don't think that's because humans live in it. I think that's because governments choke it. I think governments choke these cities, and Western hemispheric capitalism and other types of capitalism too, but other types of colonialism maybe as well. They're the reason for the formation of overexploitative cities. And David Attenborough is not helping by making giant blue chip documentaries that show the natural world as being outside of where you live, as being, you know, landscapes that can be beyond your comprehension. That's also nature. But this is nature too, because nature is also about human communities and human societies. And it pushes, I think, further this idea into societies of humans where we go, oh, we're human and that's nature. So human stuff is human stuff and nature stuff is nature stuff. You shouldn't go in nature areas. You should let them grow because then nature is allowed to grow. And it's like, well, you're also part of nature. There needs to be a reciprocal regenerative environment that you exist in with nature. You cannot allow nature to grow or not grow based on how you feel it should look or how you feel it should be understood, unless you reciprocally live on the land, unless you are local, unless you are indigenous, because then you understand the land. You have felt the land, you live with the land, you see the land as not just a resource to be taken from or something to be built over. You see it as an entity. So when I'm like, oh, humans shouldn't, you know, be talking about how land should be used, blah, 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 I am definitely not talking about all humans. I'm talking about majoritively settlers, colonialists, and people curated to a system of privilege and access.
Yeah. The people that are able to put in place like the planning permission for areas as opposed to and things like that.
Mm-hmm. And even to an extent, people who can also be affected by those things, because obviously settler colonialists can also be working class settlers. They can also be people who don't have a lot of access to resource. However, if you are settling in that area and by desperation, you are carrying out patterns of oppression, then you are still part of the problem. And you should also not be guiding what happens to that land necessarily. There should be a land back initiative to hand those areas, or perhaps guidance of those areas. No, hand those areas over. I don't think it's radical enough to go guidance of those areas. To hand those areas over to people who, again, have lived with that land, who have understood it. So I think that's I think it's really interesting to talk about how cities are natural as well, because then you break down this idea of natural and unnatural. And that also comes into queerness and queering, right? Because then you have to split it down, break it down.
Yeah, because I find myself often getting a little bit tense, or I get a little bit of the ick whenever it comes to oftentimes when people describe certain things as natural or unnatural. I think there's something inherently potentially problematic with the ways in which we ascribe natural and unnatural. Because, for example, we will try and naturalize things like capitalism all day long.
Hmm.
We'll say our own versions of the greed is good speech until we're blue in the face.
Hmm.
In according, at least within the power structures. Um, but in my mind, we kind of have to recognize that not only is compassion natural, not only is community natural. The area where I first started to come against this kind of thing of natural and unnatural and how do we use that and why was when we're talking about stuff related to criminology, which I kind of relate in a similar way to you when it comes to being a marine biologist in recovery, because criminology is inherently another study and another tool that is a part of this colonial horrendous structure that is fundamentally harmful and traumatic to certainly someone like me who is queer, disabled, and is working class. And so like the interesting thing is that the course that I did was a critical criminology course, so we had inherently baked in a lot of fundamentally questioning why and does this system deserve to exist, which I'm thankful for because there's a lot of other criminology courses that are not the case. Anyway, that's not the point. The point is, I came across a lot of people describing human behaviors as natural or unnatural.
Hmm.
And in particular, when it comes to people that commit crimes and when it comes to people that maintain certain levels of power. I don't like it when we start to say that certain people are monsters
Hmm.
because for me, that is then us trying to distance ourselves from the fact that that is still fundamentally a human that's doing that. And if we want to handle the problem of a violent system, or we want to handle the problem of, say, people who commit certain kinds of violence or people who act in certain ways that are exploitative
Hmm.
overly, then we have to accept that that is a human. Doesn't mean that what they're doing is fundamentally natural, but if we allow ourselves the comfort of putting it all on this monstrous other thing, that's not us. We're always going to be blind to the ways in which we're participating in that and furthering that.
Hmm.
Um, and so like there's a lot of that in like pathologization is essentially what it is. It's fundamentally a pathologization. The more that we call people monsters, the harder it is to argue against things like the death penalty, right?
Hmm.
And um, the more that we kind of hold these ideas of natural and unnatural in a inherently, if it's natural, it's good.
Hmm.
And if it's unnatural, it's bad. And how can we hold that to be true
Hmm.
when, as you're saying, cities are natural? And a lot of the there's a certain level of exploitation and exploit here in the literal sense of, as you say, deriving good and deriving benefit from a certain place, resource, thing. That there's an element of that is natural, right? Because that's what a food chain is fundamentally.
Hmm.
Um, so like I came across that kind of thing in a very different area where it's a much more social thing of who do we describe as natural or unnatural and why, and
Hmm.
how much does that afford us the ability to pretend that we're good when really that often means we don't have to do anything.
Yeah.
And yeah, where do you see queering as when it comes to that kind of pathologization, where do you see queering kind of coming into play?
Oh, loads, loads. My God. Because again, with queering, especially when you're attaching it to queering ecology, you are redefining what is more valuable, in a sense, within ecology to be considered alive or not. Because,
Yes.
you know, the reason I use insects is one, because I love them, and two, because I've kind of grown up with a lot of I feel like my guides within ecology have been bugs, the way that they move, the way that I interacted with them when I was a kid. Um, Found myself around a lot of bugs a lot of the time. They're very abnormal because they're not considered within the normal patterns of ecology. We only figured out a couple of years ago that they breathe because they breathe so differently to how we do. We only really discovered, you know, a couple of years ago, again, within Western hemispheric science, because this has all really been covered in other forms and other patterns in ways that I can't even fully get my head around, but I'm trying to, within other cultures and narratives. But within Western hemispheric science, we only recently start to think about the fact that they care, that because they look different, because they care different, because they think differently, they are not unhuman in a way that they are not alive. It's more that they are non-human as being other organisms, but we are all alive in different ways and different versions and patterns. And therefore, we need to understand what aliveness is in different ways. We can't just say these are the foundations and paradigms of being considered valuable enough to be kept alive or to be supported. And that comes directly into what you're saying about natural and unnatural, because it is about redefining what those words mean. And I think in this kind of pattern of thinking, I would argue that there are some narratives that they're not only bad takes, but they're also quite boring, and they're also quite useful. So quite
Yeah.
useless almost in the whole trying to figure out where we go from here. And one of those is, are billionaires natural or unnatural? I think it is a very boring and useless argument to go, well, let's consider something to be unnatural before we get rid of it. And it's like,
Right.
you don't need to do that step. For
Yeah.
example, if I'm going, Israelis are occupying and colonizing Palestinian land, and people are going, well, some people are saying that they're unnatural and it means we have to take direct action. And some people saying, well, no, but they're human, they're alive. So we can't be supporting the killing of other humans. We can't be supporting the making of them into monsters. To me, that is an argument that doesn't need to happen. What you're talking about is the occupation, the violent occupation and colonizing of land, and the
Yeah.
violent destruction of vulnerable and also just even just people, Palestinian people, who have existed mutually and reciprocally with that land for so long. And this happens in other lands as well, in other nations. You don't need to go through the whole Western hemispheric, should we theorize whether or not it's useful or powerful to go ahead with the thing because we've worded it in a
Yeah.
certain way? No, you just need to do it. You do need direct action against the Zionist government. You do need direct action against environmental toxicity. You do need direct action against billionaires. It's not whether or not they're natural or unnatural. It's because that's an overly exploitative and very toxic, violent, damaging force to people who must be protected, to land that must be protected. But also, it's something that you don't necessarily even get a say in, because if someone's being directly affected, for example, by a billionaire who forms a healthcare system and structure that then decides to make medical assistance, medical resource massively over expensive, which means people die en masse, that is a direct affected thing. That is people who are being directly affected. And if you are not directly affected by that, you don't get to say, oh, I think it's quite unethical to consider billionaires to be unnatural. Therefore, maybe we should consider them to be more natural and therefore alive, and therefore we shouldn't take action against their existence. And it's like, you don't get to do that. If people are being directly affected, you need to validate that pain. You need to understand that it is not about natural or unnatural existence. That is about the fighting back that people are doing to take control of their lives, to have a space to be regenerative, to exist. So I think within the whole natural and unnatural argument, And within queering too, queering is not just about going, everything now must be queered. Everything now must have queering plugged in. And it's why I'm so suspicious of queering, because actually it's about choosing when to put it in a place. It's about going into certain spaces and going, now in a circle where there are Indigenous people talking about their experiences within the environment. Queering doesn't need to be here. Queering doesn't need to be here. It's an introduction that doesn't need to be made. It's an introduction to embodied liberation that doesn't need to happen in this space. It's about understanding where my proximity is to oppression, where my where I stand in relation to oppressive regimes and governments, because I am connected to them, as we all are. So therefore, the unnatural and natural, argument can happen in some spaces and doesn't need to happen at all in others. I think it's useful when it comes to conservation, because of course, what we're then talking about is, oh, this organism is doing this, which is considered unnatural. Therefore, I must now destroy said organism because of a reason I'm not going to tell anyone, which is what happens in most colonialist conservation, where a lot of colonialist conservation is sourced in government control of land and exploitation of land. And the government in name here happens to be colonialist government. So, for example, the British Raj within India formed a lot of conservation practice based off of the practices that they had over exploiting the land, of moving predator and their prey items, which happened to be the herbivores that were used within resource management or resource access for very rich families that had taken over the land at the expense of farmers and local people. And those patterns were then enshrined into conservation as a movement, as a study. And then from Western hemispheric science, it was then embodied within the practices that they took all around the world. So now a lot of conservation practice is based on colonialist conservation practice that actually ruins the land and destroys it because it's seeking to exploit it. And it's passing itself off as being natural, as being something that is trying to arrive back at the balance that is being determined fundamentally by colonialists who don't understand the balance between land and other organisms, who simply understand quantitative balance. They don't understand the actual balance that is embodied within considering land an entity. It's more about, well, these numbers seem the same. There are this number of predators on said land. There is this number of other organisms. There are this number of humans. It can be useful, I think, because again, we're going into a new kind of future where we don't know a lot of what will happen. And we also are playing with a lot of factors that haven't existed before. So we do still need to, I think, understand what we have now within science, within conservation, within ecology. I don't think it needs to be necessarily erased. I think it should be understood as having toxic patterns so that we don't do it again. And also it should be kept as these are progressions that we've made in our understanding of the natural world. They are formed on exploitation and toxicity, so we should be aware of that. But we do still need to understand how people have thought through that, to understand what people are going to do and how governments have controlled the narrative around conservation so that we can unravel it and undo it. So in that, I think there's a really useful place for the unnatural and natural conservation conversation to happen. I do that all the time, my God.
Yeah.
For that to happen.
Yeah, and I think that one of the areas where like this conversation of natural and unnatural and how that's actually not very fruitful for us is that one of the ways that is going to be most, I think, relatable to our audience is when it comes to the like born this way narrative or the sort of, man trapped in a woman's body narrative or this, that, the other. Because when we get into the conversation of born this way, that's still fundamentally an attempt to naturalize something within this framework of if it's natural, it gets to live. And one of the things that kind of would always bug me about that is this thing of like, well, you can be queer and never act on it. And this notion of like, what if we say born this way and we hold that as that's the reason why I deserve my rights because I was born this way. well, that's still holding this idea that like you have to be in a fixed place and you have to prove that it's innate to you before it's worth anything.
Hmm.
And I think that that is something we should fundamentally rebuke when we're having to work in this political system. And when so many of us are denied the ability to know ourselves for so long, like, yes, I was born trans, sure, but so what if I wasn't? Like, if that narrative wasn't there, that doesn't mean that we aren't justified in wanting our rights and wanting to live. Like, even if we weren't born queer, right?
Hmm.
Or born gay, like, does that mean that gay marriage wouldn't have any right to exist? And I mean, then we're getting into a whole other conversation on assimilation and
Hmm.
not assimilation and things like that. And yeah, like I think that there's often a sort of there is a feeling and a need to sometimes sort of put things to bed or to find this ultimate argument that no one can get out of.
Mm.
And I think that we often end up falling into the trap of playing the game that
Hmm.
is being used against us,
Hmm.
right? And it's one of those master's tools. The idea of naturalization, ergo you deserve to live, is one of those tools. Um, but at the same time, like that is something that people feel a lot of joy from. It's by all means like if someone is like, no, for me saying I was born this way, um, is like a very important and powerful thing, and I'd never want to take that away from anyone. But like there is a conversation about queer joy. And queer joy is something that we talk about a lot on the pod. We have a section called Trans Joy at the end of every episode where we just get like little submissions from things. Anything from I had my favorite dinner last night to I've just gotten my top surgery, right? But I wonder there's an element of like queer joy, trans joy. What do you think about the practice of queering joy and what that can look like?
Mm. Oh, that's really interesting. I think kind of tagging in what you've just said, the idea that again you can use this system in order to liberate, fundamentally it's, it won't work, because again it's about, well, if you are able to use that system, you're probably more curated to that system of hierarchy. You're probably more curated to be able to access the resources within that system. Therefore, you might become one of the oppressors because you are able to use those systems so well that you don't notice a lot of the time the stuff that you are doing that is oppressing people. But you also, even if you do realize, you might not be able to do anything about that toxicity because you're so plugged into that system. Therefore, in order for that system to be destabilized, you need to be uncomfortable. And people don't want to be uncomfortable because that's an uncomfortable thing. Discomfort is not something that we seek out necessarily. We can seek out in other areas, but we don't really seek massive levels of discomfort if we want to be in an environment where we feel comfortable. That is a juxtaposing sentence, but you know what I mean. We don't seek out I've just basically said we don't seek out discomfort if we want comfort, which is silly. But we want comfort a lot of the time. Big
Yeah.
assumption to make a lot of people, but in various ways. So if destabilizing the system of privilege means that you are uncomfortable, is that the case for everyone? No, not really, because different people obviously experience different types of comfort in this system from different things. And joy is interesting because joy doesn't mean the same thing for everyone. Joy
Hmm.
is something that I think we're presented as it being a very positive thing, as something that everyone can share in. Everyone is allowed joy. And therefore, when everyone is allowed joy, the world will be healed. So we should always seek out joy and we should always seek to be joyful. And we see a lot online, joy is resistance. Your joy is resistance.
Mm.
Your existence is resistance. That is true sometimes, but it's also not true a lot of the time. And it can be very damaging a lot of the time because there are very privileged people whose joy is actually the reason that other people are being oppressed. Their
Hmm.
comfort, for example, if you are a very elite person, or if you're someone who's even not that elite, but you're privileged enough to be able to consume on a large basis, you are consuming resources, you are buying things, you're also buying into a capitalist system, You might not even be boycotting products. Therefore, your joy is causing the oppression of other people. If I en masse buy boycotted products, if I go on holiday in occupied territory, if I am taking part in schemes in online structures, if I'm using websites that are basically funding the mass military industrial complex weaponization of army bases overseas, if I'm using something like AI, if I'm using ChatGPT and it's using up vast amounts of water in areas that don't have enough water for the people in them, that is pumping out large amounts of carbon into the environment, and there are no care systems to take care of the people in those environments who are then choking on that and who are not able to fight it because they can't afford lawyers, then my joy is oppressing other people. So my joy isn't resistance in that case. So now I have to consider, well, it's not that my joy is not allowed, it's that my joy needs to be more careful than other people, because there are more oppressed people in systems whose joy is never allowed. And so therefore, any scrap of joy that they get is resistance, because they are keeping themselves alive. They are keeping themselves alive in a way that if they didn't feel that joy, they wouldn't exist, because the system is constantly choking them. And I've seen it online being said by, Dr. Black Deer on Instagram is an indigenous queer scholar and activist. And they talk a lot about, well, they talk a lot about a lot of different things, but they more recently touched on joy and how joy is actually something that can be weaponized. People can feel a lot of joy and it can oppress people. And I think that is a good place to start when you're thinking about, what will my joy do? Is my joy oppressive, or is my joy resistance? And I think as a transracialized person who also has a bunch of privilege in the way I speak, in the way that I move around the world, I have that privilege, but I also am oppressed in so many ways that I have to think very carefully about my joy and about whether or not my joy is liberational. And I don't think my joy is necessarily liberational. I think my joy is divestment. And I think a lot of people within empire, joy is divestment. And your joy, especially as a trans person within empire, depending on also your other identities and the other factors that play into your privilege, it's probably going to be divestment, which is useful, but maybe don't consider it to be liberational necessarily. Because if you consider it to be liberational, you are basically imposing that your joy is going to free us. And actually, your joy can divest you from the toxic normality of being oppressed. It can give you an escape. It can allow you to be maybe free in your mind. It can allow you to be free maybe in your personal space for a few hours, potentially, maybe even a few days. But it will not liberate the world, because you are too curated to the system of oppression, which means you divest from it. And that doesn't necessarily cause liberation, but it could pave the way for the oppressive system to be dismantled, which would then have a big part to play in the liberation of people and also the liberation of yourself. I think that you can play with joy, you can redefine it. Joy isn't primal necessarily in the way that it's foundational and it will always be the same. I think we talked about this a bit earlier as well, about being born this way, and the idea that, even earlier than this, we also talked about like compassion and how, people are compassionate and how that's natural. Some people talk about that, don't they? They say, it's natural for human beings to be compassionate. Why have we learned to be so evil? How have we learned to be so toxic, so horrible? But care is developed. Care is not something that you come out knowing. I'd say that you have a basic blueprint genetically for things to happen. That basic blueprint is like a very flat, it's a very flat surface with a few little bumps in it. And those little bumps over time can become bigger and bigger and bigger. The more of life experience is piled on top of them, which means they're layered up and they become huge. And then you have a pattern of behavior. And now your genetic interaction with that has caused you to have that pattern of behavior, not because you were always going to have it, but because it's more likely that you'll have it because of things that you may have had in your past ancestry. And so care is not something that you come out feeling or being. It's something that's developed because you can develop a care for certain things. You can develop a pattern of care for certain people, for certain structures, even for quote unquote nature. A lot of CEOs that I used to talk to of wildlife organizations would say things like, we try and get in touch with racialized young people about nature, but they just don't care. They don't care enough about it. So we just don't do anything more because they won't accept the things that we have. And to that, I always say to them, well, the normality that you're used to talking to is white privileged kids in areas, or even white underprivileged kids, but areas where they have a lot of access to quote unquote nature in the way that you've referenced nature to be. Therefore, they also have the time, they have the education, they have the space to develop care about a certain thing. They are not naturally caring of those things. They are just allowed the privilege to develop the care. So therefore, care is developed, compassion is developed. And I think joy is also developed. Joy is something that you develop around things you care about, things that give you maybe even respite in an area of sadness or desperation. But they are also things that come out of, I like this, therefore I want to be able to like it more. I now have the space and the education and the time and the facilitation to care and love this thing more. So I take joy from it. But you can redefine that. You can deconstruct that. I may have grown up liking the taste of Coca-Cola. That gave me joy. I can redefine that. I can restructure that. I can start to enjoy other things. I can also start to implement despair, tiredness, exhaustion, pain to that thing. And then I don't derive joy from it anymore. So therefore, joy isn't really a primal foundational thing that you come out feeling and you sort of go, oh, when I, for example, I see this like trend on TikTok where people, a lot of white people, a lot of privileged white people are like doing things like standing by a river and going, oh, you use AI to get your therapy. I stand by a river. And I feel, I feel joy from that. And it's like, I don't think this is a primal thing that you're feeling. I don't think you're feeling the pull of the spirit of the river. I think you've just had enough space and facilitation to have access to the river in a way that you feel joy around it that a lot of people might not have. It doesn't mean that now I'm saying it's acceptable to use AI as therapy. And it doesn't mean that it's not acceptable to use a river as therapy, which is quite a beautiful thing. But you need to understand that it's not a primal foundational factor of your being to feel that level of specificity around joy. So therefore, queer joy isn't foundational necessarily. It's something that you can grow and develop. And depending on who you are and how privileged you are, you will grow different kinds of queer joy. And that joy can still be oppressive if you're queer. Being queer doesn't necessarily mean that you're just a good person overall.
I'm gonna pull up a phrase that we've put in our notes here because we've had a couple of calls talking over sort of what kind of things we want to talk about and go into. But this you can probably tell listeners at home that this is a bit more freeform than the average interview. But it sounds like what you're talking about here is the way in which joy can be a shield to complicity.
Mm-hmm.
And that's an interesting phrase that I was wondering if you could maybe break down for us a little bit more.
Yes. I mean, you basically broken it down really, really well. Anyway, joy is a shield and can be used as a shield for complicity. And the example that I kind of draw on over here is when I made a little post online about another David Attenborough thing. Unfortunately, he's becoming more of this episode. I really hope that he doesn't colonize this episode. He's only in here as a bad thing. We're trying to divest from
I like the idea of you slowly developing a like he is becoming the mortal enemy, the villain.
He's the problem.
Yeah.
But I used the example of a recent documentary that he made with Disney. And this documentary was about the ocean. And people were drawing on it because some environmentalists got invited to the premiere. And also there were a bunch of indigenous and native folk who were referenced within the documentary. And also David Attenborough did a thing that he never did before, which is where he talked about how the destruction of the ocean is due to colonization. It's due to...
finally!
Well, he did, yeah. And people online saying, oh my God, Attenborough said it's due to colonialism. Finally, we're waking up. I have a big problem with that because there are entire communities of people who have died screaming that this is the issue. Suddenly an old white guy says it on TV and you're like, oh my God, you're right.
Yeah, like that's ridiculous because
Right?
it's like the reason why I say finally is like you've been doing this for so long, you should have pointed this out
Yeah.
by now
Yeah.
because you don't get to not be aware of it if you're in the position that you are. If you're in this position of authority where you get to be the big nature granddad, you don't get to either you're incompetent and you don't know it's down to colonialism or you've been hiding that tidbit because it's going to make people that are watching it too uncomfortable. But if people are taking it as finally we're waking up, then oh my God, you're still so asleep. Like,
Yeah. And on one hand, there is this argument about, well, we shouldn't turn people away from a movement that we need more people within because we need unification. We need people to come together and to fight against a common enemy, kind of colonialist in the way that that is put. But we do need that. However, you know, you can also talk about how elitist people are owning certain narratives in the media. So whilst there are big communities on the ground doing embodied liberation work, there are large online communities of privileged people who are talking about things as if they're new. And those communities on the ground are not being heard. Therefore, we think that the work is new, but the work is not new. The work is being done and has already been done for many, many, many years, and is actually the reason why we aren't in as bad a position as we should be. Because a bunch of the time we look around, and I look around as well, and I go, I'm in quite a privileged position. That's not because the system is working slowly. It's because there is embodied work done around the world to stop it from happening as fast as it should have happened. The destruction of the planet, the destruction of communities and structures of care is being held back by communities that are not heard. They are fundamentally doing the work already and have been doing it for years. And therefore, we are actually only safe in the positions we are because they have stopped it from becoming a reality sooner. The idea that people would wake up online, but actually have already woken up in their masses and they aren't online, they aren't being shown, or they are being erased from the media narrative, that can also be brought to light by the fact that David Attenborough says a thing and people are like, oh my God. But then going back to the original point that was kind of making off of that, David Attenborough makes this documentary. This documentary airs. It is made by Disney. Disney are meant to be boycotted from, but a lot of people are not boycotting them because they have other things to boycott and they have some comforts that they keep. And therefore, the narrative around this was, well, the documentary is good. It brings to light certain topics that have never been brought to light before. Attenborough says a thing he's never said before. Therefore, we can do it. We can promote this documentary. To which obviously the response is, no, you're not allowed to do that. You don't get to do that. You don't get to pick and choose a narrative that is suddenly okay-ish and therefore allows you to not boycott one of the largest, most destructive capitalist machines on the planet, aka Disney, which is also funded by BlackRock, which has also got its hands in Microsoft, which has also got its hands in every single media erasure that we were just talking about, and the destruction of local land and land grabs around the planet. What we're talking about is, the realization that we are complicit in everything. And we don't know if we'll ever not be complicit because we want to be. Divestment is moving towards non-complicitness. It's moving towards moving away from toxic normalities and systems. Therefore, we want to be not complicit, but you need to be aware that you are always complicit in every single structure of oppression that happens around the globe if you exist and live and work in a capitalist colonialist empire system. So if I'm talking about Disney and being complicit and Disney being complicit, and then everything that you do is complicit, you don't get to pick and choose where you suddenly allow certain structures of oppression through because you are part of the problem. You need to try and be as away from those oppressive structures as possible. And that, of course, is within how much privilege you have, because you still recognize that if I'm keeping certain structures for myself because they allow me some sort of comfort in a world that is quite terrible, that's still a privilege. that's still something that I'm oppressing someone through. I need to be aware of that. I can't just go, oh, it's okay. It's not okay. But there are certain things you need to do to survive, and they aren't okay. But be aware of them not being okay. Don't just go, oh, it's fine because I need to survive. Recognize that it is an oppressive thing and continue maybe for as long as you can, but try and move towards divestment as the ultimate outcome of this. And again, you may never move out of that. If you're complicit overall in every single system of oppression that happens around the planet, if everything that we receive, every technology, every joy, every ecological understanding is part of an overall umbrella of complicity, of colonialism, of control, of conformity, I'm painting quite a terrible idea of the world, I realize, but that is the case. If that is the case, then joy, of course, is used as a shield within that complicity, because joy is not necessarily about I'm just happy. But within a capitalist colonialist society, especially a Western capitalist colonialist society, emotions become tiny. They become finite. They become linear, because identity becomes linear, which is the whole issue with queerness anyway, because queerness is not linear. Queerness and queering.
No.
Exactly. Queer identity is non-linear. It's non-binary. It deconstructs that.
Yeah, because I think that there is this, like, when it comes to queerness, to go back to that topic very briefly, like, when we're talking about queerness and it being that thing of being the quote abnormal and being out there, there is still inherently a quite white construction of what queerness is and was initially, right?
Mm-hmm.
And like I saw there was a bit on another podcast that I saw a clip from that highlighted this really well by being like, when it's queer people talking about queerness and talking about how it's still quite in when it's used as a label can often be quite a white thing still. For example, like I think someone was asked, I would have to state that I'm a black queer person, but when you put down things on your CV, do you say queer or do you say white queer?
Mm-hmm.
Right? And it was like when they were having that conversation, I was like, that's really smart. That makes a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we've now successfully constructed an understanding of some of the horrors
Mm-hmm.
of this system that we live in. And I think it's really hard sometimes for people to hear things like that and not take it to a place of shame and to a place of oh, so we just aren't allowed anything, we can't, and it becomes quite a, I think, defeatist thing. But I kind of recognize it as the only way we're going to be really effective is to, without judgment of the self, recognize that that is the position that we're in. Because then that means that you can better figure out what you want to do with it. And recognizing that sometimes joy can be a shield to recognizing your complicity. I wonder, what other shields do you recognize frequently?
I mean, every single emotion that is made tiny within a colonialist or capitalist system can be used as a shield, because as I was kind of like touching on before, joy in the non-colonized sense is about anger too. It's about pain. It's about fear. It's about feeling beyond this idea that joy means euphoria. Joy is not just impulse. It's not just I interact with something and I feel euphoria. That seems a very linear form of joy. That simply seems like a lack of impulse. And a lack of impulse is, interestingly, how I've referenced white queer spaces, because white queer spaces, from what I've seen, are built out of this idea that whiteness imposes normativity, whiteness imposes patriarchy, toxicity within a system that is previously outside of that. And this can even come into how whiteness within the colonialist sense actually destroyed its own self before destroying everything else. Because, of course, we talk about the British Isles as being one of the first areas to be colonized, not an absolution, because colonization is not white in source and actually comes from a lot of different areas and a lot of different patterns. But the colonization that we see most around the globe now in the most terrifying and destructive form is somewhat lubricated and moved forward very quickly and very largely by whiteness within the current sense of colonialism. That means that the British Isles that were destroyed by colonialists moving in to Celtic tribal areas, destroying said culture, processing land to the point at which we live in the most processed patchwork, destroyed landscape that is the British Isles. The biodiversity is so low because of that processing that has happened over so many years. That colonization is then shipped out across the rest of the world, and that's how that occurs. But that means that actually what's happened is you've made things into linear structures. You've constructed your emotions as linear because that is a form of control. That is a form of conformity for people, because then you only know how to be joyful in certain small ways. And white queer spaces come into this because if that blanket of colonization has occurred, and then you need to get out of it, you form a small, desperate space of freedom, a small bubble of liberation, but it's your liberation. And you make that small, desperate bubble. And within that bubble, you get to feel things you've never felt before. You get to feel things you weren't allowed to feel within the constructed normativity of colonialism and capitalism. And those things are very impulsive. They're very interactional. They are things that you now can feel suddenly. You're allowed to do that because of how curated you might be to the system itself, which means you can be a bit free of it in the most impulsive and interactional way, but you don't go deeper because don't necessarily need to. If, for example, you are more privileged and therefore you are allowed to create said space in the first place. So therefore, emotions can become quite linear and small because they are so impulsive. And therefore, what we see now as mainstream queer joy in the most privileged sense is not joy in a depthy or holding sense. It's not joy that builds communities. It's not joy that moves through the toxicities of different people. It's not joy even necessarily that will build liberation. It's a small, impulsive, interactional divestment from the toxic normality of despair. And that is powerful because it's introductory, like queering. But is it going to build liberation? I don't think so. So it needs to be depthier. It needs to hold more. The joy needs to be bigger. So I'd say every emotion, even like anger and fear, that are built within a colonialist capitalist paradigm, that are carried out by elite peoples, that are carried out by people who are more privileged to the system, white people, heteronormative people, cis people, able-bodied people, people who tap into the patriarchy. These things allow people within those categories to experience emotion linearly and to experience it impulsively. And if we consider those are complicit because they uphold the linear emotion. And so I think emotions that go deeper, emotions that come from communities that are outside of that control and that conformity, they could be ways of breaking down those shields. And then we come to the idea of default transgressors, which is an interesting term.
When you're talking about that sort of transactional element of joy as we've come to kind of recognize it in like those large privileged spaces. It actually reminds me of something that I've had to kind of grapple with in a neurodivergent sense, which is the concept of dopamining, if you know it. And it's like the idea where if you look at the ADHD brain, and you know, we're already pathologizing, but it's an awkward thing. So when looking at the ADHD brain, we seem to operate with a different kind of dopamine structure, or in the fact we have a lack of dopamine production or dopamine uptake. I'm not a neurologist. I'm just tapped. So there's but dopamining is this process where, you know, you're operating on a dopamine deficiency. And so ADHDers will often you'll find a thing that provides you a bit of dopamine. You go, "Oh, love that. Want more of that." And so you start mining it, if you consider it that way, where you start just digging further and further and further and further. And this is how people can develop, like hyperfixation on some things. It's how you can do massive amounts of productivity on something because that's what's giving you joy. But it also can be a great way to fall into really unhealthy, toxic patterns of behavior because you become attached to this thing. You fundamentally, well, not fundamentally, but you can often end up in a position where you're dopamining, but is that healthy? Is that
Mm,
sustainable for you? Is
mm,
that actually going to allow you to um, get the most out of what you can do and what you do want to take from it? Or is it going to eventually burn out
mhm,
or have consequences that you aren't thinking about because all you're thinking about is the next hit of dopamine? And I think that we have perhaps a little bit of a dopamining relationship sometimes with queer joy in that
mm,
sense.
mhm,
Because I've had to become mindful about dopamining so that I don't end up for example, I used to love Diamond Art, and I would sit there and I would do Diamond Art for ages. I'd sit there for 2, 3 hours at a time. I am also disabled. I would end up dopamining the diamond art until the point where my back hurts so
mhm,
badly that I then have to actually rest, as
mm,
opposed to the act of diamond art itself being a craft that is restful and meditative and joyful for me. Like, sure, if I
mm,
meditated for 3 hours in a sort of more active, hyper-focused way, but now my leg's spasming and my back hurts, and I'm gonna have to like figure out the next day how to operate, then it's not sustainable. Getting back into the conversation properly,
mm,
now that we've spoken a lot on what the situation is and how we kind of see the world and
mm.
construct it and how hard it is to really find or really unearth that authentic, I guess, I'm going to move away from the language of authentic. I'm going to say the sustainable ways of really moving forward and making sure that the steps that we take aren't so easily undone. How do you see people, certainly us when we're in the central crown jewel of empire,
Mm.
how do you see us being able to imagine a way forward? Like what kind of tangible ways do you think that we can um, imagine where to go from here and how to move forward out of this system.
Oh, the money-making question. Not to
Yeah,
use
the big one.
capitalism again, but it is the question that people are asking more and more. It's,
Hmm.
we're tired of trying to think a way out this. What do we do? What do you
Mm.
do when you're stuck in this system? First of all, I would like to say that I do not have the answer.
Yes,
And
of course. It was a trick question.
um, and that's good to be aware of that. To, if I talked this entire time about not knowing what liberation looks like and suddenly gone, but this will liberate you, then that would be utterly ridiculous. So of course, I
Yeah.
don't know what will liberate us. But in the kind of practice of trying to embody liberation more, it is the recognition of things that you've just talked about, where you don't think of therapy or wellness or comfortability or your understanding of the world to be absolute. You don't accept absolute normality as the only way that things are done. And people would maybe think, if you're listening to this and you're trans or you're queer, you would go, well, yeah, I mean, that's my life. Like, I don't accept the normality, which is why I exist. The interesting thing is, of course, you might break down certain normalities by existing, but there are many, many more underneath that you still are within. There are many, many more
Hmm.
assumptions that we still have of the world. It's quite difficult to break down some of these normalities. I get it when I'm looking at insects. So if I'm looking at
Mm.
insects and I'm trying to use them as this kind of center of deconstruction of normal ecology, I will look at a fly, for example, that has completely different chromosomal structure to humans, completely different in a way that you couldn't possibly tie a fly into being male or female in the same way that we would tie a human being into it. Because again, that's not foundational to human beings anyway. It's also a complete miscommunication of what X and Y are. We know that they aren't that shape. They don't actually do what they say they do. They aren't absolute in the way they perform or provide us with the hormones that we consider to be male and female. That just isn't the case. That's majoritively communicated to provide a normal narrative of what a human being is, which is more curated to the privileged human being and the way that we are supposed to go forward in life. So even putting that to the side, the human being is tied into that non-consentfully. The fly is now also tied into that non-consentfully, but in a really strange way, because they actually are by default transgressing the idea of binary male and female, because they have completely different shaped chromosomes that do completely different things in their bodies. But even though I know that, I'm still looking at a fly and going, the female fly. No, wait, not the female fly. The egg laying fly. Wait, no, that's not the reproducing fly. Oh no, wait a minute. Because the language I have is not liberational. It is either exploitative, where I refer to the fly as a gendered organism without consent of said fly, and also just because I go, oh well, the fly lays eggs, and that's just about the only thing. The fly lays eggs and has babies, and therefore I can only think of one way of referring to this fly, and it is female, because I'm suggesting that reproductive rights are an enshrined part of female identity, and therefore I'm drawing on the colonialist and capitalist identity of femininity and of womanhood, and therefore I'm suggesting that a cornerstone of womanhood is reproduction, because there's the only one thing that I can tie the fly into, and it's reproduction, and so therefore I'm suggesting that it's a female fly. And if you think about it like that, it's kind of ridiculous that you're referring to them in that way at all. But because the language I've got is so non-committed to being non-linear, it's so terrible, it's so overly exploitative, I can only try and divest from that. I can go, the egg-laying organism. This is the egg-laying fly, which of course is only one tiny factor of what that fly does. Let's put aside the fact that they regenerate naturally. They put energy back into a system with their actions in decomposition. They don't just remove waste. They inject energy back into an ecosystem so that it can be recycled and used in things like weather, in things like other organisms' capabilities and energies. That is an incredibly magical thing. But instead, I'm focusing on this fly lays eggs because I can only think of it in a linear sense, which means, again, I've got so many assumptions to break down, even though I'm trans, even though I'm racialized, even though I'm queer. So I try and look at all of these identities as being somewhat transactional. I'm buying someone's perspective of me, but I actually don't really identify fully with them. And that can kind of be a way of quote unquote going forward. Because also I think we're not really supposed to be going forward anywhere. We're trying to grow outwards, maybe. We're trying to deconstruct some things and grow in other areas. We're trying to sit more comfortably with chaos, I think, because what capitalism requires of us is efficiency. It requires a linear structure that you sit in comfortably and you stay in your lane and you move in one direction and you arrive at that direction and you are easy to predict. Therefore, you are easy to market to. Therefore, you are easy to educate and you are easier to control. You don't need to think about too much. You just move to one point in time. And people, to different extents, might break this down a bit. They might go, oh, well, I don't want a job, so I'm going to do a lot of the things that I do simply for enjoyment. Great. But that's kind of impulse-based joy again. That's not really depthily going, well, if I can do that, that's probably because I'm more privileged to be able to do that in a society that should not allow you to do that.
Yeah, like I was gonna say, who has the ability to do that and why and where did you get that resource from to be able to decide to just do what you wish?
Therefore, what's a way that I can maybe move away from that idea even? And it's probably understanding source and context of things. But that's also a privilege. That's also something that needs to be facilitated. So therefore, maybe a way to move out of this is understanding what care spaces look like, where people who are not privileged enough to take part in the dismantling of the structure of conformity can sit comfortably or can be comfortably and can guide from. And this might look like protecting your third spaces, your care spaces, libraries, community centers, public owned land, publicly owned buildings, or spaces that are owned by community, and provide some sort of reprieve from not only the toxicity of a government that is oppressive, but also the toxicity of individuals that just want to burn everything down. Because there's also, the problem I have with anarchism and anarchists who generally come from a white socialist structure or from a privileged socialist structure is that what you want to do is dismantle a system that you believe you can live without. And that's great. But there are a lot of people who have been made to lean on this system non-consentfully. You have to be a part of it sometimes because you've been given no other option. You know, people get their food from a certain area because they can't afford to get it from elsewhere. People live in a certain space, get their electricity and their water from a certain area because they've been made to be dependent on crumbs. So therefore, you saying that you want to burn down the system that they lean on is going to put them in harm's way in a way that you are privileged enough to be able to hide from, to be shielded from. So instead of thinking like that, the better idea, I think, maybe, is to consider how to build and protect your care spaces. Build and protect your third spaces that allow for community to be built, and also understanding where you sit and how you can build and protect spaces for other people. If I have a certain privilege that allows me to be shielded, maybe I should be using that to protect, and maybe not protect in a savior way, but to stand in the way of something that might destroy a community that could guide, maybe guide our society towards a better place. There is also a problem with that as well, because you're giving all of the responsibility of guiding this society to a better place to oppressed people, and you're not giving them any resource. So being flexible with that. But I think for now, we're in a divestment phase. We are trying to deconstruct and dismantle. And it gives me a lot of liberation to think, like liberation in my own sense, and maybe not in a larger sense, to think that I can dismantle a normality. So if I, for example, can get a group of racialized folk within a city to understand and maybe even be joyful in their own way around insect bodies and how insects interact with the land, and that helps them to build a better idea of what liberation looks like, and that helps them to build a better idea of what land justice looks like and how we live alongside other organisms, that to me is a fundamental growth that could maybe help our liberation in the future. So I don't think there's an algorithm. I don't think there's one way that we're going to be able to do something in the future. I think, or even now, I think there's only multiple threads of divestment that we can focus on, and communities that we need to build, because community is a bit of a charged word as well, right? Community is thrown around a lot, but it doesn't actually, it doesn't mean necessarily unity or even spaces that are safe or even comfortable for the most oppressed people.
Yeah, like Mumsnet is just as much of a community, as rancid as it may be, as your local queer coffee shop. Fundamentally, community is only as good as the actions of the people within it. And to that point, like, who do you think is already doing some of that work? Are there any organizations or any groups or any people that you're saying that you recognize, like, I like what they're doing, and I want to see more people get involved with the stuff that they're doing it. Where do you feel that kind of spirit is already being maybe applied, or what kind of places and spaces do you think that we should be directing more of our attention to?
I'd probably say it's difficult because, I mean, it's not difficult, but it's difficult when you talk about like how to get involved with spaces, because of course there is the front of you can fund and protect, or protect is probably not the greatest word to use there. There are spaces that you can fund and provide access or resources to that will, again, the building of those spaces is just going to make our lives better just by them existing. Yeah. And those tend to be Black, queer, environmental, I think, or land justice groups. I think those groups, and also Indigenous queer land justice groups and environmental groups, and spaces where you're providing resource for those groups to grow and to better build their own safety and security, and to also understand liberation, understand futures, and reimagine futures. There are certain people online that I've seen do some really incredible things and who should be supported more. And there's someone called Yafar, and Yafar is a Palestinian queer artist and author and writer. Yeah, Yafar's Utopia on Instagram. They are a very, very, I mean, a very cool person. But they also write a lot of really good books, and they put a lot of work into helping people to understand what actions they can take, especially now when there's a lot of despair. There's a lot of people getting hopeless about what to do. And the way that I kind of push back against that hopelessness is by looking at one of the things that they said, where they said, your depression, your grief will not help these people. It is valid, but it will not help, because you going, I am sad because of from what I'm seeing, is something to keep with you and to maybe move through and to understand what to do with, but it is not something that necessarily will liberate. So therefore, more can be brought from going, oh, I'm not liberating people here. My actions as, if I have a trans group that are meeting to talk about joy or gardening or environmentalism, it's very beautiful. And it does reimagine the society we exist in. And it does provide necessary divestment, because it provides something where we can feel safe, we can feel comfort, we can maybe build something from that. But it's not liberation. We're not liberating the world in that space, but we are divesting from the normal. So maybe at the end of all of this, what I'm telling people to do is to break down normality, to deconstruct it, to question literally every single reality that you're given in a facilitated space, to then understand your positionality in that questioning, and to focus more on divestment than liberation. Because once you do that, I think you do start to feel, okay, I can divest, I can move away from things. And even if I get sad, even if I get depressed, or I start to feel the world's never going to change, I'm not the one who is supposed to do that. I'm not going to save the world. I'm not going to change the world. We are too close to empire to change the world in that way. But what we can do is move stuff out of the way so that other people can. We can deconstruct and divest, and we can find a lot of our own joy through that. We don't need to be the main characters in this story. We don't need to be the saviors of the world. The production of food for our communities, for example, is a very necessary, powerful thing. Will that change empire? Probably not. Will that help us feel comfort in our lives so that we continue to be able to divest, so that we continue to be able to think about these things and be the default transgressors that we are? Yes, which is pretty powerful in of its own way. So maybe moving away from this, like almost like Western hemispheric movie style sense of liberation, where you stand on top of all of the corpses with like a flag and you raise your fist in the air, or there's flames behind you and you're the one who saved the world. It's like, no, you don't get to do that.
Yeah.
You are the
We are
individual.
not living in V for Vendetta, that's
Yeah,
for sure.
exactly. And
yeah.
why would we want to? When we're trying to figure out how to move forward, we are going to have to sit down and listen if we're in spaces like this. If we're in societies that are so close in proximity, as I've said, to oppression, the loudest voices are probably not the ones that we should be listening to, if they are, again, privileged enough to hold a platform that is more mainstream. And this can change because of social media, because of the way the internet is now reconstructed societies. There are people who have very loud voices who are people to be listened to. So it doesn't even work for everyone across the board. But most of the time, like I've said, this work already exists. This work is already being done. Like with Yafa online, like with Dr. Black Deer on online too, like with some of the other Black environmentalist groups that I can kind of put links to afterwards, like just the trans environmental groups that exist. A lot of this stuff that I'm talking about will be environmental based, ecology based. There are also a lot of spaces that practice grief. What a lot of groups will have to do now is support and be guided by sets of groups. this is also, it's going to be a time of understanding our own proximity to oppression and realizing where we sit and how us being in certain spaces, dependent on who we are, can have a negative effect on those spaces, can take up too much space. So we also have to consider, where are we going? What spaces are we moving into? Is this a space where I can grieve without my grief erasing the grief of other people in this space?
Mm-hmm.
Am I moving into a space where I am taking up space to the point that I'm becoming the oppressor in this space? Is it resistance? Is it divestment? So a lot of that will probably have to be done on the parts of people who are more privileged in this system. However, we are also going to have to realize that, like the whole conversation on making people unnatural or natural before you take direct action against them, some of these conversations don't need to be had out loud. They don't
Mm.
need to be had in certain spaces. So maybe think more about, oh, well, me thinking about this is useful because I have a set of assumptions that govern how the reality around me works, which means I have control over that and I have influence over that. So I should be thinking about that. I should be deconstructing that. I should be doing what some people call system thinking. I should be critically analyzing stuff. That's really powerful. But right now we have a lot of desperation. We have a lot of groups that need to have the access to things to do stuff now. And when that's the case, sometimes you don't need to bring those conversations into those environments. You just need to support what they're doing. You need to support their action and their right to resist and their right to exist. And this comes into ecology a lot more than people think, because ecology as a word means the study of the house, which is interesting because eco is house. So economy is actually management of the house or management of the home. Um, and ecology is the study of that home and that house. So within that, you are understanding your house, you are understanding your environment around you. Therefore, a lot of this is going to be about you. A lot of this is going to be about the social interactions of the human organism, of different humans in different places, and the different interactions we have with other organisms. So we are going to have to think about our proximity to privilege and oppression. We are going to have to talk about all of these things that affect us in ecological spaces too, in environmentalist spaces too. But we are also going to have to say, well, if I am this kind of person in this space, does me talking about this create more problems than a future of liberation or a future of divestment? So probably lots of thinking is going to have to be done, and a lot of supporting of action that you might not necessarily understand, but you understand that the people who are doing it are revolutionary in the way that they go about things. And a lot of things that you don't need to understand before you take part or you support them. So even if you don't fully understand what a free Palestine will look like, it's not your right to say, I don't believe this is going to work, therefore I'm not going to support the direct action of Palestinians, because logically I can't see how Palestine will be free without, for example, you might say a two-state solution. That's not your right to say that. You might not understand how it will work, but actually it's fundamentally not an argument that you get to have. And this goes into environmentalism as well. There are a lot of ecosystems that you don't get to say, oh, this might work because of this way, because I have worked within conservation in Western hemispheric regions. Therefore, I have more knowledge than indigenous folk on the land in which the ecosystem stands. You don't get to do that either. But you might be able to support and pave the way for that space to be made possible, for the regeneration to occur. And so maybe it's also about realizing how little we know and how little we actually understand of the world and how much more we have to unlearn, which goes right back to divestment. We're not liberating, we're divesting. So we don't know a lot. So we're trying to unravel. So let's just focus on unraveling and how we do that carefully and how we care for people through that unraveling, because it's going to be quite painful, right?
There's a kind of I've just noticed a kind of almost a specter looming over this conversation, really, that we've not, I think, properly been able to address, which is the, as we've spoken about things about, like, whether you're feeling the call of the spirit of the river or you're sitting down and just have more access to it, or when we're talking about free Palestine and we're talking about colonialism, a lot of this is tied into and around religion. Um, and I'm curious where queering can come in there because there's not only the obvious elements of religion being a part of many of these tools and systems, but there's also the mixture of a lot of trans and queer people that have trauma related to religion. There's also the ways in which religion can be for some people can feel very liberatory.
Well, queering and religion is its own topic and also not its own topic. Because just quickly touching on that, the biggest reason that I came up, well, I didn't come up with it, but the biggest reason that I started using queering as a term was because I was like, this isn't a topic, this isn't a subject. You know, if I make
Mm.
it into another subject, it starts to recycle the oppression of the system it's meant to be deconstructing. It starts to create another linear form of thinking, another discipline, which of course is not something that we need more of. So queering and religion, really interesting circles to push together or to overlap within. As a Muslim person, obviously, I do have to talk about religion and how it's one of the way that I've accessed spirituality. And spirituality has been necessary for my understanding of not just queerness and myself, but also of ecology and of the natural world, quote unquote, natural world, the non human natural world, and other organisms. My relationship with spirituality, one might say, is foundationed within toxicity because the Islam that I came from is a thread of Islam that hinges on patriarchy, that hinges on its own forms of colonialism, because it is from a section of Islam known as Wahhabi Sunnism. And Wahhabi Sunnism, I'm not going to go into all of the ideas and identities and structures, but it would seem that as one of the largest, most mainstream sections of Islam, has in many nations and through many communities become an arm of patriarchal colonialism that is not necessarily centered on the deconstruction and dismantling of a lot of communities in quite a terrifying and toxic way. However, if I'm foundationed within that, I've also had my culture and I've also had my connection to spirituality become tied to the religion that I grew up within. So I use that pattern of accessing spirituality, and therefore I am Muslim because I practice it, because I understand some of the world through its lens. But I also know that it's not all of the threads of me, my Muslim identity. I'm not necessarily suggesting that foundationally this religion is accepting of queer people, because it really depends on what part of the religion you are sectioned within, what stage of it, and what reality you are interacting with. I would suggest more that from my point of view, and again, this is all built on my own perspective and doesn't necessarily need to be the case for everyone, but from my point of view, if you are going to queer it, you're still dismantling the toxicity of that religion from yourself. And so therefore, I'm considering Islam to be a pattern that I tap into, to be a part of me, because it's a part of me that I've grown up within that I don't necessarily want to be free of. And also, one could argue I can't ever really be free of, because in order to understand and learn a new pattern of accessing spirituality, that would require momentous energy on my part that I don't have, and space that I don't have, and facilitation that I don't have. So I need to recognize that when I'm talking about my identity as a Muslim within this like queer structure. And then also we come to, queerness, like we've just said, is foundation within whiteness in the way that it's understood in the language of queerness, because the interaction itself of dismantling that normality of binaries and heteronormativity, that is thousands upon thousands of years old and has been recognized and realized in many nations and communities that have existed far before and far beyond, will exist far beyond queerness as a structure. I sometimes talk about how a necessary factor of a regenerative future is queer dying and queering dying, where the structure of queer as a term becomes something new. It becomes something different because it's meant to regenerate. Because regeneration, as we've just talked about, is also a big part of transgression, or transgression is a big part of regeneration, and vice versa, where you transgress a normality in order to regenerate that normality. And that can be for toxic or nourishing patterns. But regeneration, if it includes transgression, and if the transgression is against normality that has been formulated so strictly and so strongly that you feel pain transgressing that normality, then you exist in a terrifyingly non-regenerative system, because that system rejects and pushes back against regeneration. However, if you exist maybe in an uncolonized system, transgression isn't so painful, because it's not that the act of transgression is bad. It's not that the act of transgression needs to be, I need to break down the normal because it's evil. Transgression is just creating new normals. It's just breaking down the old normals. And that could be a comfortable thing. But I think when it is a comfortable thing, that's a sign of a regenerative ecosystem. That's a sign of a regenerative society. If it's painful to transgress, that is the sign of colonialist, capitalist, terrifying system and structure. So within that, religion sits, right? Because religion can exist as an arm of toxicity sometimes, or even a field for toxicity, depending on who's using it and who is growing it and what spaces it exists in. So it exists much the same way as other identities. And also it's older sometimes than so many other identities. And also I kind of disagree with the idea that, you know, religion means anything necessarily to do with an idea of God, because religion could also be something like economy. Religion can also be, you know, even atheism can be religion. These are like, just because you don't exist in a linear idea or construction of God, or a linear idea of practice or pattern of religion, does not mean that you're not religious, because religion can just be consistent behaviors that are tied to sacrifice or joy, or even, you know, something that's just tied to a linear idea of worship. And you worship many, many different things. So religion exists in so many different mechanisms and patterns.
For me, I mean, this is something that we can delve into properly, but for me, transness is an inherently, like, spirituality and transness to me are very intertwined in my personal experience, and a lot of that has had to come from reconstructing my understandings of belief, of faith, of you know, the power that can come from those things, and on the way that the body responds to stimuli, and how that's something that can be really powerful and evocative. And I think, you know, there's so many avenues that we can go down with that. But yeah, you saying that the economy can be a religion? Yes, absolutely. Very much. Like we treat so many things
Uh-huh.
within our, like, Western Hemisphere society culture in this sanctus religious sense. But we
Mm-hmm.
divorce it from the mythology that, I mean, maybe mythology is the wrong word to use here, but we divorce it from the stories and from the parable, the elements, the mysticism, really, I guess,
Mm-hmm.
of like those religious structures. But we
Mm-hmm.
still deify football teams in a certain way and things like that. Is there anything else that you kind of want to bring up or talk on? And if not, then I have one final question for you.
One of the biggest reasons that I have tapped into transgressiveness and transgressional existence and understanding myself from an othered human point of view has been insects, and it has been other organisms. And so queering ecology is just, for me, a way of understanding the way I've been thinking since I was so young. And it's not that I was thinking, oh my God, I love nature, let's talk about nature, because I was thinking about that for a bit of my life, but that was only because that was the way to me, as being the way to communicate about nature. So I thought about it in that kind of sense. But really, queering ecology is just me trying to understand why I think the way I do and why the world is the way it is. And I think tapping into understanding organisms from a decolonial point of view, from a divestment point of view, from a, you know, a sense where we talk about social justice as related to and intertwined with ecology and environmentalism, where we talk about economics as a part of environmentalism and ecology, where we talk about how trans rights and, you know, the whole argument and law and policy and everything that's around trans rights is related to speciesism and the ways that organisms that are not human are viewed in this environment, in this society, they are all related and interconnected. And by understanding those other organism values, guidance, whatever you might call it, patterns from non-colonial, from uncolonized, from non-Eurocentric, from non-mainstream centered points of view and perspectives, that is part of trans rights. That is part of racialized people's rights around the globe. There is no way that you can understand queering ecology from a point of view where you don't talk about decolonialism, much in the same way that if you want to talk about trans rights, you're going to have to talk about racialized people's rights. You're going to have to talk about working class people's rights. You cannot be talking about them in a vacuum. And if you are, then you definitely don't understand the full picture, or you've just woken up to the fact that these things are connected. And that's most majoritively because you've been using complicity as a shield, and you haven't been looking the way of people who are or have been screaming about this for, many, many decades. So I think kind of like tying up those ends is queering ecology is not just something that I like to study and talk about. It's a full like practice of existence. But it's also very unfinished because it's not meant to be finished.
I like that.
It's just a divestment practice. It's very much, it's like my queer it's like my kind of trans and queer identity and journey itself. It's very unfinished, and it's not meant to have an outcome. It wasn't meant to go anywhere in the first place. It's meant to divest from all of the toxic normals that have been imposed on me. And so eventually maybe new terms will arise and new structures will come from it. But yeah, that's what it really is kind of about. So yeah, those are just some like ends that were kind of flapping about in the wind. And I
Yeah,
was
no, absolutely. And to tie up this whole conversation, I'm going to ask the dreaded question, your least favorite question of all. What is your favorite bug?
I knew this was coming, and I'm glad that you brought it up.
Listen, I didn't go for the bait immediately, but you knew that I would in the end.
I knew this was coming, and I'm very glad that you brought it up because I said that we would touch on it, and then I was afraid that we wouldn't get to, but no. Okay. I don't have an answer for this, of course. I don't have one favorite bug. I have a group of bugs that is my favorite group. And this group is parasitic wasps or parasitoid wasps.
Oh, go off,
yes.
because I know a little bit about these and they are metal as fuck.
They're so cool. They're so cool. And I love them so much because they change biological realities in the lifetime of a larvae. And we can get into another time how larval stages of insects are actually just other versions of insect realities, not necessarily baby to adult life stages, in the same way that humans would have them. That's something for a different conversation because, insects don't have baby to adult in the same way that we do. It's just a completely different reality to another different reality. But parasitoid wasps, they change realities. One of the things they do is they make galls. And galls are when a part of a plant, it can be a lot of, it can be a different part of the plant. It can be the leaves. It can be the tiny little elbow where the buds come out of the twig. It can be the root. It can be anything on this plant. And the interaction with a parasitoid larval insect or a parasitic wasp will change the structure of that plant to the point at which it forms something around the larvae. And the larvae is taking nutrients from that and is growing within it, is being protected by it, not just from predators, but from the weather, from temperature. It's all kept in this little capsule. And they're changing the structure by siphoning off of it. And they're changing the biological reality of this plant. And I think that's so transgressional. But they also, they're changing our idea of lived reality, because my favorite, that I just said that I didn't have a favorite one, but I might have a maybe a bit more of a favorite within parasitic wasps. Very bad. But my favorite-ish kind of parasitic wasp is something called the fairy fly. And the fairy fly is the smallest winged insect that Western science knows of. And the fairy fly is so small that the air that we're just breathing that is blowing past us, this fairy fly has to swim through this air because it's so small that the air is just too thick in the way that the air is constructed for it to fly through it. So it has to swim through the air because it's so small we can't even see it. And a lot of parasitic wasps or parasitoid wasps are like this. They're so tiny that we don't even know they're there.
That's so cool.
I know. It's so, so cool. They're one of the most diverse groups of animals on the planet. There are probably more types of parasitoid or parasitic wasp than any other organism on the planet, and any other animal on the planet. I would then have to go, if I said organism, I would have to go into bacteria and fungi, and that's a whole thing. But yeah, they're like, in terms of animals, they're the most diverse group, alongside maybe beetles. There's like 4-ish different kinds of beetle for every other animal on the planet, which is pretty cool. Beetles are also really, really cool. But with parasitic or parasitoid wasps, they are changing our understanding of realities, I think, because with this tiny little fairy fly, it lives and dies on the body of another parasitic wasp that it parasitizes. That parasitic wasp lives and dies on the body of another parasitic wasp that it parasitizes. So they're hyperparasitizing. And then that parasitic wasp will live and die on the body of, well, not necessarily live and die, but will parasitize the body of a caterpillar. And that caterpillar will live on a cabbage.
Amazing. I love that.
If you think about that, that parasitic wasp has an entirely different idea of reality than we know it. Because if it's living and dying on the body of another parasitic wasp, which is living and dying on the body of another parasitic wasp, their worlds are ultimately completely different than the realities we live. It's transgressional in a very shallow and basic way, because it's just like, oh, well, they live different lives, therefore they understand the world differently. And that's, you can think of that of what you will, but even the way that they breathe, the way that they think, the way that they move will be entirely different to the way that we do anything, which means we have to change our idea.
Yeah, it'll be as close to us as a creature on Mars would be. And that is wild to think about. Right? I was gonna say my answer is a lot simpler. My favorite insects are dragonflies and snails. Snails because they've got the spiral shell, dragonflies because they're shiny and they're green, and you see it like big dragonflies. They are like, oh, I love them. I love them. But yeah, thank you so much for this deep dive, deconstruct into queer ecology. This is one of the coolest interviews I think I've ever done. I've really, really enjoyed this.
Thank you for having me. It's literally been one of the most exciting conversations I've had recently. And yeah, I feel very tired, but I feel very nourished. And
yeah,
I'm excited.
I'm in a similar position right now, yeah. So I hope you all enjoyed that as much as we enjoyed talking about it. Not gonna lie, this has been one of my favorite interviews that I've done, and I know I keep saying that, but I'm only gonna stop saying that when I stop interviewing really cool people. So, the trans community is just gonna have to be a little bit less fucking fantastic, unfortunately, before I stop saying, oh my god, this is so cool. I hope you've learned a lot. I hope that there's been some cool things to take away. I learned a lot in this. And I think this kind of community conversation is the sort of thing that we need in order to be able to make sure that we're all protecting each other and we're all working towards a world that looks better for everyone. Obviously, normally we would follow this up with some trans joy. Well, I'll provide some of my own. So I went and stayed with some family recently. It was actually very lovely, very wonderful. And in a little thank you speech that they did for an older member of the family's birthday, they mentioned me by name, and they did the right name. And that was cool, and that was very fun. So even though we haven't done our normal big trans joy for everyone, I hope that's a little bit of something at least to take with and enjoy. Thank you ever so much to not only Jasmine for sitting down and having that amazing conversation, but to all of our wonderful Patreons, including the producer level Patreons. I'm not going to read you all right now because I am only one set of lungs, but you all know who you are and you are wonderful and amazing. And also, I will briefly shout out the two new producer Patreons that we have, which is SAP and Sabrina Artis. So welcome to the crew. Obviously, you can find us on all of the social media network things, the Blue Skies, the Instagrams, our own site. We've got that. Yeah, go check it out. Remember to water your pets, neuter your plants, and piss off a fascist today. All right, love you all. Bye. Oops, nearly forgot the credits. So, this episode of What the Trans was presented by Flint and Jasmine Qureshi and produced by Jasmine Qureshi, Flint, Ashley and Alex, and written by Flint and Jasmine Qureshi. It was edited by Amber Devereaux, and our opening theme music was composed by Wartsaw Yui Kohlberg. Our thumbnail episode artwork was created by Upo Piers, and transcription performed by Sam Wyman, Rowan B, Rachel Aldred and Georgia Griffiths. We would again like to thank all of our wonderful producer level Patreons, and have a wonderful evening. Goodbye!